Okay, welcome friends. My name is Frances Kramer. I'm the Director of Education at Pendle Hill. We're so glad you're here. I am delighted to be joined today by Stephen Angell, discussing his learnings from a career of engagement in the fields of Quaker studies and African American religious studies, separately and in tandem. Since 1990, Stephen Angell has taught religious studies at two institutions of higher education. From 1990 to 2001, he taught students at a predominantly Black university, Florida A&M University in Tallahassee, where the course he most frequently offered was Black Religion in America. Since 2001, he has taught at Earlham School of Religion, where he teaches a variety of Quaker studies courses, as well as a course in American religious history. Among many other commitments, he has been a member of the Pendle Hill Board and co-chair of the Afro-American Religious Studies Unit of the American Academy of Religion. He is a member of the Oxford Friends Meeting in Ohio and lives in Richmond, Indiana, with his wife, Sandra Ward Angell, and two cats, Rosie and Pippin. I have a few logistical notes to share before we get started. Stephen will share his lecture with us, and we will have an opportunity for question and answer at the end. To support our speaker's focus, we have disenabled the microphone for participants, and I will also be disenabling the public chat now. Please feel free to send questions for Steve or logistical questions to me directly, the host, throughout the lecture. The questions for Steve, I will consolidate and ask him at the end in the question and answer time. With that, I will invite us into silent worship and invite Stephen to speak from the silence.
Good evening, friends. So delighted you could join us. He could be with me this evening. Tonight, I'm reflecting back on my career teaching in higher education, and especially on a portion from about 20 years ago to 30 odd, when I was teaching at Florida A&M University in let me share my screen. In August 1990, I arrived at Florida A&M University, historically Black university in Tallahassee, Florida, to teach religious studies there as part of the philosophy and religion program at FAMU. Let's see, how do I advance my slideshow? not figuring out how to advance the slideshow, so I may try and do without it.
Could you try just pressing the right arrow, the forward right arrow? Does that work? While you're clicking on the screen.
Let's see what, let's try it a different way. This is what you saw before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can do it that way.
Okay, a couple months previously, I was not the first member of my family to either live or actually teach in Tallahassee. A couple months previously, I had a conversation with my uncle and aunt, Brad and Imogene Angell. Uncle Brad recalled that he had been hired in 1949 to teach at Florida State University, which is the predominantly white university in Tallahassee. Florida State University, FSU, and Florida A&M University, FAMU, were on the opposite side of the railroad tracks in Tallahassee. Geographically, they were only 1 mile apart, but they inhabited two entirely different worlds. The leading philosopher at FAMU, Brad, was a philosopher. So the leading philosopher at FAMU was Jim Hudson, a really dedicated and active foe of racial segregation. In the decade after 1949, Professor Hudson would play a major role in strategizing for the civil rights movement, the freedom movement in Tallahassee. It's really not known very much today, but the first bus boycott in the American South after the one led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Montgomery, Alabama, first one after that happened in Tallahassee. And Professor Hudson was a chief strategist for that. Brad recalled that the first time he met Professor Hudson was in a national philosophy conference. He went up to introduce himself and was startled to find out that the man he was talking to had an office only a few blocks from his, and that they had to travel across the country to meet. Imogene worked as a receptionist at a local dentist's office. She knew that whenever Jim Hudson would come for his dental checkup, he would always come to sit in the whites only waiting room, a legal violation of Tallahassee segregation ordinance. Imogene consequently made sure that there was always a dental chair completely unoccupied when Professor Hudson arrived for his appointment. She would say, "Right this way, Mr. Hudson," and usher him through the waiting room to the empty dental chair for his appointment. Prior to accepting the appointment at FSU, Brad had served in the United States military during the Second World War as a medic and conscientious objector. Dedicated deeply to the cause of human rights, Brad organized an interracial meeting of the veterans of foreign wars in Tallahassee. This too was illegal under the segregation ordinances in the city and state. The Ku Klux Klan broke up this first interracial meeting of the VFW, and they demanded that Brad and Imogene leave Tallahassee in 48 hours. President of FSU intervened and worked out a compromise with the Klan whereby Brad could complete his courses for the year, but then would leave Tallahassee and FSU. Next year, Brad would earn his living up north by selling encyclopedias. This kind of racial threat and violence was all a living memory for my older colleagues and friends who lived in Tallahassee. They regarded it as something that must never be talked about. But in the 4 intervening decades, Tallahassee had changed. The freedom movement that Professor Hudson was so instrumental in organizing had a large effect on laws and politics. The Tallahassee city government and the Democratic Party, who provided most of the winning candidates in city elections, in 1990 was no longer dedicated to the bygone era of segregation, but was on the whole progressive on matters of human rights. FAMU was a cherished institution that embodied continuity for Black Tallahasseans as a place that nurtured a powerful sense of community for African Americans in the city and throughout the state of Florida. On the other hand, racial hate had not totally evaporated. My students were keenly aware, for example, that David Duke was running for governor of Louisiana in 1990. There were still threats to Black well-being that were entirely too close at hand. I taught lots of courses at FAMU, but the one that I taught most often was Black Religion in America. It was a novelty for a white professor to be teaching Black religion at FAMU. Not all my students were certain that my teaching these courses was a good idea. I pointed out that I had considerable academic study in the area. I had written a book on the Black Methodist Church during the 19th century, and I was publishing steadily in the area of African American religious studies during my time in Tallahassee. So I had thoroughly prepared myself for teaching Black religion. My students, on the other hand, some of them, wondered if it was wise for someone who had not experienced Black religion in any continuous way in my formative years or any other time in my life to be teaching that subject. I would reply that many professors come to the subjects that they teach as outsiders. An example might be a Black professor teaching European history. A lot of this discussion, a lot of this talk took place behind my back. And Ron Liebert, a dear friend and my colleague in religious studies, African-American himself, proposed wisely that it would be best for the subject to be addressed head-on in a forum that was open to everybody in the school. I agreed, and that forum was in fact held. While I was present to listen, I did not speak myself. I was interviewed subsequently by the school newspaper, the FAMUan, which not only published a news story in the forum, but editorialized on behalf of my teaching the Black religion course. I was grateful to all who participated in this forum, and especially to my colleague, Professor Liebert, for organizing it. We don't often pay such close attention to critical pedagogical issues like this, and we should probably do that more often. I'm going to organize this around a few key teaching moments, three that occurred at FAMU. The first question, is this is something that came up almost every time I taught the course. When I taught Black Religion in America, I did not include Quakers on the syllabus. Still, it was well known at FAMU that I was, and actually I still am, a Quaker. And usually sometime further on in the semester, the students would ask me about it. So I talked about how Quakers became convinced of anti-slavery convictions in the first place. That despite egalitarian rhetoric by George Fox, the Quaker founder, and others, there were some Quakers in the Western Hemisphere who owned slaves. Quakers in Sugar Island of Barbados. William Penn owned slaves. He vacillated in his various wills as to whether he'd free them. But then a phalanx of Quaker anti-slavery reformers, Benjamin Lay, John Woolman, Anthony Benezet, Warner Mifflin, brought about a change in Quaker discipline on the subject. I tell them about Philadelphia Quakers, and in 1758, the yearly meeting approved a minute that forbade Quakers from buying and selling slaves, and set up committees of Quakers to visit Quaker slaveholders and urge them to free their slaves. And that by 1774, Quakers had come to consensus in Philadelphia yearly meeting that any members who continued to own slaves should be disowned. Quakers in other parts of the Western Hemisphere made the decisions on a slightly different timetable. So Quakers were the first European-derived church which came out as a body and condemned slavery. And then I would discuss the role of Quakers in the later slavery movement and the women's rights movement. And by and large, my students were very impressed by all these things that I had to say. But at the end of this mini lecture, some of the thoughtful students remained skeptical. They were unconvinced. They'd say, the Quakers have done all these fine things that you said they've done. Why are there so few Black Quakers? Or am I missing something? How many Black Quakers are there? I would tell them they were onto something. I was part of a Quaker meeting in Tallahassee. There was one Black family that had membership in our meeting. In the meeting, there were also some white families who had adopted children who were African Americans. But on the whole, the meeting was very white. And what was true of Tallahassee Quakers was true of most Quaker meetings in America. They had few Black Quakers. Quakers had initiated missions on other continents. And by the 1990s, the number of Quakers in Africa, Latin America, and Asia had come to outnumber those in Europe and North America. So the majority of Quakers worldwide were persons of color. But the same could not be said of Quakers in the United States. Looking forward, I maintained my hope that Quakers would extend their outreach to persons of color and become a truly multiracial, multi-ethnic religious society of friends within the United States as well as outside of it. I still maintain that hope years later. Then after class, I would go and research it some more because I didn't know as much about this topic as I thought I should. So I found out that this was not a new matter for inquiry and discussion. It is in fact quite an old one. Carter G. Woodson, widely known as the father of Black history, addressed the issue in his History of the Negro Church book he first published in 1921. Woodson noted the advocacy by George Fox for religious instruction of African Americans and the extensive involvement of John Woolman and others in bearing a testimony against slavery. But Woodson believed that Quaker silent meetings stood in the way of attracting all but a handful of African American converts. Faith of Quakers, their religious procedure, and peculiar customs could not easily be understood and appreciated by Negroes in their undeveloped state. This was a kind of explanation that went back before Woodson, for example, to the founder of African Methodism, Richard Allen, who argued that the shouting of Methodists was intrinsically more attractive to African Americans than the quiet worship forms like those practiced by Quakers and Episcopalians. And even to somebody like Sojourner Truth, who was very closely admired Quakers greatly. They had helped herself gain freedom, her children gain freedom, but she said, that worship was quieter than she wanted, and she said she became a Methodist at least earlier in her life rather than Quaker, because the Methodists would let her sing and the Quakers would not. Later in her life, she actually was most closely associated with the progressive Quakers, who were probably the left wing of the Hicksites, who were probably the least quiet of all the Quakers in the mid-19th century. But then Woodson, 13 years later, to his credit, realized that he didn't, he didn't have the full story. So he published a contrary viewpoint in his Journal of Negro History, an article by Quaker Henry J Cadbury entitled Negro Membership in the Society of Friends. Cadbury held that, on basis of his research, that Friends worship practices were not the main reason that Quakers attracted few African-American converts. While he noted that Quaker evangelistic efforts had slackened by the 18th century, and thus Quakers were not attracting many converts of any race during that time period, he felt that the social prejudices of Friends were probably the main reason that Quakers were not attracting African-American converts. It may be supposed that Quakerism failed to attract Negroes because of the quietness of its worship, as Woodson and Allen had supposed. But Cadbury saw no reason that religious temperaments should be distinct from one another solely on the basis of color. Admissions by a few African-American applicants, Cadbury showed, were delayed far longer than those of white applicants. One, William Bowen of Mount Holly, New Jersey, John Woolman's home meeting, was admitted to membership 4 decades after he first applied. Cadbury noticed the indignity of segregated seating inflicted on in the 19th century, mid-19th century, on longtime African-American attenders such as Grace Bustill Douglas and her daughter, Sarah Mapps Douglas. Grace Douglas was explicitly cautioned by members of her Philadelphia Northern District meeting not to apply for membership. A careful scholar, Cadbury noted exceptions. For example, the extensive African-American membership in the meeting in Helena, Arkansas, that was formed after the Civil War as white Quakers from Indiana established a school, Southland College there. In era 1935, when most Quaker schools in the vicinity of Philadelphia, in the vicinity of Pendle Hill, still excluded African-American students, Cadbury was squarely laying the blame for the small numbers of African-American Quaker members on, he wouldn't use these terms precisely, but the inhospitality, even sometimes even hostility of white Quakers. Woodson died in the 1950s. Others have continued this discussion, including Donna McDaniel and Vanessa July in their landmark 2009 work, Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship, Quakers, African Americans, and the Myths of Racial Justice. In Black Fire, African American Quakers on Spirituality and Human Rights, Hal Weaver, Paul Kriese, and I uncover the 1982 work of Vera Green, whose empirical research found some aspects of Quakerism to be attractive to African Americans. But she did not perceive, on the basis of her research, obvious opportunities for large-scale convincements of African Americans. In any event, much of this important work, including both Fit for Freedom and Black Fire, were published after 2001 when I left FAMU to teach at Earlham School of Religion. So I did not have the benefit of them while holding class discussions with my FAMU students. The second issue here is trees. One day, and this is pretty early in my tenure at FAMU, and for reasons that I do not remember, but I happened to be holding forth effusively on the beauty of trees in Tallahassee. However, it is true that the beauty of trees in Tallahassee was one of many reasons I enjoyed living there. My residence had a remarkable ancient live oak in the front yard that I estimated was more than 100 years old. I am something of a nature mystic, as was a notable African-American theologian who spent his youth in Florida, Howard Thurman. At a time when Thurman was often lonely and weary of hostile white supremacists, and he even did not always have great support within the Black community. He saw trees as his friends. Quote, I felt rooted in life, in nature, in existence. When the storms blew, the branches of the large oak tree in our backyard would snap and fall, but the topmost branches of the oak tree would sway, giving way just enough to save themselves from snapping loose. I needed the strength of that tree, and like it, I wanted to hold my ground. Eventually, I discovered that the oak tree and I had a unique relationship. I could sit my back against its trunk and feel the same peace that would come to me in my bed at night. I could reach down the quiet places of my spirit, take out my bruises and my joys, unfold them, and talk about them. I could talk aloud to the oak tree and know that I was understood. It too was a part of my reality, like the woods, the night, and the pounding surf, my earliest companions giving me space. My students had another perspective. My reverent expressions on the topic were interrupted by a student who said, "See, Dr. Angell, we don't have the same views of trees that you do. Black people here in the South were lynched from these trees." For this student, and presumably for others in the classroom who were giving him silent support, the trees were a constant reminder of the grievous wounding that the African American community had experienced at the hands of terrifyingly vicious white supremacist mobs. This called to mind the haunting musical classic, Strange Fruit, written by a white Jewish school teacher, Abe Mirapol, and performed memorably by Billie Holiday. The first verse has these lyrics: "Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black body swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees." This song appears to be all about the South. I no longer live in the South, but one curious fact is that Mirapol felt compelled to write this song by his reaction to a photograph of a 1930 lynching of Thomas Shipp and Abram Lynch in Marion, Indiana, about 70 miles from my current residence and place of employment, Earlham School of Religion in Richmond, Indiana. As Malcolm X would sometimes bitingly observe about the pervasiveness and extent of white supremacy, anybody who lives south of the Canadian border, he said, lives in the South. Lynching is not a topic that most white Americans want to give much thought to. My student certainly startled me that day by bringing it up in my classroom. But white Americans, including myself, are susceptible to dangerous delusion and self-deception if we do not attend carefully to the chilling evils of this form of mass violence, often announced beforehand in the newspapers, almost invariably accompanied by torture of its victims, frequently occasions for white celebrations attended by thousands, while nearby African Americans hid and desperately sought ways to protect their physical and mental well-being. It is American history, something we must carefully learn about ourselves, teach our children to decisively reject. Many years subsequent to that memorable class session, the renowned Black theologian and historian James H. Cone published The Cross and the Lynching Tree. As I read and reflect on Cone's work, I find insights I would have wanted to discuss with my class. For Americans, the memory of disfigured Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze is so painful that they try to keep these horrors buried deep down in their consciousness until, like a dormant volcano, they erupt uncontrollably, causing profound agony and pain. But as with the evils of slavery and Jim Crow segregation, Blacks and whites and other Americans who understand the true meaning of the American people, Blacks and whites and other Americans who want to understand the true meaning of the American experience need to remember lynching. To forget this atrocity leaves us with a fraudulent perspective of this society and of the meaning of the Christian gospel for this nation. While the lynching tree is seldom discussed or depicted, the cross is one of the most visible symbols of America's Christian origins. Unfortunately, during the course of 2,000 years of Christian history, this symbol of salvation has been detached from any reference to the ongoing suffering and oppression of human beings, those whom Ignacio Ellacuría, the Salvadoran martyr, called the crucified peoples of history. The cross has been transformed into a harmless, non-offensive ornament that Christians wear around their necks. Until we can see the cross and the lynching tree together, until we can identify Christ with a re-crucified Black body hanging from a lynching tree, there can be no genuine understanding of Christian identity in America and no deliverance from the brutal legacy of slavery and white supremacy. Cone, in that book, Professor Cone talked extensively about, he used a lot of poetry that explained African-American responses to lynching. The most famous of these poems, one that you may very well have seen before, was written in 1919 in the aftermath of World War I, when Black veterans coming back from World War I were viciously attacked, and there were white supremacist mobs attacking Black people in places like Chicago and East St. Louis. It was at this time that Afro-Jamaican poet living in Harlem, Claude McKay, pioneer of the Harlem Renaissance, wrote the poem, "If We Must Die." If we must die, let it not be like hogs hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. And then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave. And for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies a common grave? Like men, we'll meet the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. How might a nature mystic like myself or Thurman respond to this righteous lament and cry of rage? Might these trees also be victims of white supremacist violence and murderers? Might these trees also weep, mourn, even howl with rage at their being forced to be complicit in this great evil? I like to think that the trees are angry and grieving with the rest of us. Like most matters of faith, I cannot prove it to be true. Going forward, however, we can deeply cherish all life, my human sisters and brothers of every race, nationality, and religion, the animals that share this planet with us, and yes, also the trees without which life on this planet would not be possible. The third teaching moment was talking about African-American women church leaders. And prior to my classes, I would usually write an outline on the board. When I was talking about Black women's leadership in religion, I had a number of names like Jarena Lee, the first woman evangelist in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Rebecca Cox Jackson, very interesting African-American Shaker woman, Virginia Broughton, a Black Baptist minister and evangelist, Amanda Berry Smith, a Black Methodist who traveled the world to preach the gospel. One of my students, who fortunately I can't remember her name, but she came to FAMU from Southern California, came in a bit early that day, looked at my list, and she said, "I know someone who belongs on that list." So that was the day I learned about Biddy Mason. Who was Bridget Biddy Mason? Born enslaved from birth in Georgia in 1818. She, by 1847, she was living in Mississippi. She learned midwifery and herbal medicine at an early age. She was also very renowned for the good care that she could take of cows and other livestock. In 1847, she was living in Mississippi with her 3 young children when her enslaver, Robert Smith, converted to Mormonism. She accompanied Smith to Salt Lake City, and eventually Brigham Young asked Smith and Smith's family, so to speak, to go to Southern California, which was ostensibly a free state, but in 1656, Smith sought to take Mason to Texas, most likely to sell her and her children. And Mason fought Smith in court. Her victory was hardly assured, as judges in California frequently sided with enslavers in their decisions, but Mason did win her freedom. She worked as a nurse, midwife, delivering hundreds of babies. She is claimed today by social workers in California, nurses, doctors. She was a healer, an extraordinary, skillful healer. She saved her money to buy land and help fund charities, including a school and daycare center for Black children who had no place to go. Visited inmates in the city jail. She was described as a woman whose common sense was as strong as her religious faith. When the first African Methodist Episcopal Church of Los Angeles was founded, she was not only a founding member, but she donated the land on which the church was built. She died in Los Angeles in 1891 at age 72. And for those who live in Los Angeles, which I do not, probably encounter her legacy in many ways, including, for example, a Los Angeles park near where she lived that's named Biddy Mason Park. Teaching and learning are activities that blessedly flow back and forth between all classroom participants, and I'm grateful for all that I've learned from my students over my years of teaching. In 2001, I left FAMU to accept my current position teaching Quaker studies at Earlham School of Religion, and to embrace new opportunities of teaching graduate students and also teaching a subject I cared greatly about, namely Quaker studies. At ESR, one of my main courses that I've taught has been American Religious History, which I teach with great attention to the multiracial, multi-faith, and multi-ethnic dimensions of the subject. One thing that one issue that has really emerged in scholarship over the past 2 decades or so is the topic of religion and empire. And one book relevant to that topic that I've used in my American Religious History class is Sylvester Johnson's African American Religions 1500 to 2000. My students love this book. They tell me things like, "This is one of the best things I've ever read. Thanks for turning me on to this author. It's just this semester." They find it to be a dense and extremely mind-opening text. It covers a huge time period. It actually starts before 1500 with the Europeans setting up slave castles on the west coast of Africa. One scholar has written about this book. This book is a groundbreaking exploration of the conditions of possibility for thinking about African American religion, transatlantic empires, colonial enclosures, and political engagements, as Sylvester Johnson shows, are more than historical contexts. They are forces of religious formation. Johnson was one of my students at FAMU. He subsequently completed a PhD degree at Union Theological Seminary, where he studied with James Cone. He is now assistant vice provost for the humanities and founding director of the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech University in Blacksburg, Virginia. Johnson begins before the Columbian discovery of the Western Hemisphere. He writes, colonialism is the essential matrix of racialization, is what makes race. He traces a thread through African and African-American history up to the American counterintelligence warfare against both Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, and the racialization of Islam in the wake of 9/11. Race is a state practice of ruling people with a political order that perpetually places some within and others outside of the political community through which the Constitution of the state is conceived. In other words, the history of the FBI's engagement with African-American Muslims since the 1930s is the early history of the United States racializing Islam under a national security paradigm. Because Islam has been racialized, American Muslims were constituted as a coherent, unified population that was incapable of pristinely exemplifying Western subjectivity, that is Europeanness. By the terms of their radicalization, Muslims might live in the United States, but they did so as ineluctably incorrigible aliens. We must understand in the most rigorous fashion how race performs its work as colonial governance through the structures of democratic empire. And we must begin to appreciate religion as at times a racialized formation, one located squarely in the center of biopolitics. Only then can we perceive the entanglement of religion, race, and colonialism. Johnson and I are currently collaborating on a chapter on the topic of Quakers and Empire, which shameless plug here, which will appear in 2023 in a book that I am co-editing with Ben Pink Dandelion and David Watt. It's entitled The Creation of Modern Quaker Diversity, 1830 to 1937, and it will be forthcoming from the Penn State University Press. It is urgent for us as Quakers to think about how we might begin to extricate ourselves from this insidious process of racialization that is so deeply ingrained in us in the society, and to recognize a deeper sense of community to all peoples, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, persons of other faiths, African Americans, and people of color who we have not reached out to consistently, and to reach out and to not reach out in ways that continue to reinscribe colonialist or imperial assumptions and practices. Friends, if we can attain a deeper embrace of our testimonies, equality, peace, and integrity, for example, if we keep a steady gaze on the path that Johnson, Mason, Cone, Thurman, and Woodson, among others, have illuminated for us. May it be so. And so thank you for coming, and I'm delighted to respond to questions now.
Steve, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'm still integrating all the different pieces of wisdom that you shared on this subject that feels very alive at Pendle Hill right now. I wanted to start by taking a step back. As I promised, we like to ask our first Monday lectures as we transition into the question and answer period to share with us a bit about where spirit feels alive in the work that you're doing. And while you answer that, I'll invite friends in the audience to share questions with me in the chat so that I can distill some of them and share them with you. But yeah, I think as an experiment in spiritual learning community, we strive to be attentive to how the learning that we're doing kind of integrates our spiritual lives, and I think at Earlham that's very much on your minds as well. So I'm curious where spirit has felt alive for you in your work.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarity between what's going on here at ESR and Pendle Hill. So I could start just by, sort of reiterating things I think I said in the lecture, which is, sort of in the engagement with the students in the classroom is where it comes alive. But it's really more than that. It's inside the classroom, it's outside the classroom. It's in meeting, after meeting for worship sometime on Sunday. It's in meeting with tragedies in our lives. We're in partnership here at ESR with the school, Church of the Brethren Seminary, Bethany Theological Seminary. And Bethany had a student who died this past week. And so, we're having to figure out, it's what you dread, I guess, in some ways, sort of, but at the same time, it's making the community come alive and, and be real with each other in various ways in terms of grieving our loss. So it's a real privilege to be part of the community that is grappling with weighty things like that. So it's a lot. I have a hard time, sort of singling out any particular aspect of being in community as being particularly alive. I wonder how you would answer that, Pendle Hill. But it's a privilege wrestling with all of that, both inside and outside the classroom.
Yeah, I think I would have a similar answer. I think I'm visiting my 98-year-old grandfather, and he asked me, how can I be optimistic in this moment? It's such a hard moment. And I told him, I think for me, it's not so much about optimism or pessimism, but where spirit really feels alive is this sense of hope that we have when we are able to come together in community, and especially in a community turned towards learning. So I think it sounds like a very similar similar orientation, and it's something that I'm so glad to have the audience with us, the other folks who are joining us learning together, because I think that is one of the things that gives me hope and makes spirit feel alive to me for sure. We have another question, kind of starting at the beginning, about what actually led you to the field of African American religious studies.
Oh, that's a great question. When I look back, I keep finding different answers. So I was a student at ESR before I went to Vanderbilt University, which is where I did my work where I began my work on African American religions. And I was looking through my ESR student notes one day, and this was like years afterwards, like 20 years afterwards, and I discovered that I had a whole page that I'd completely forgotten about, of notes about the person that I would write my dissertation on, Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. I only remember it as happening at Vanderbilt University in a class on 19th century American religious leaders, where I was, the assignment was in that class was to become a, to choose somebody, sort of a notable theologian from the 19th century, and to actually become that person and to argue in class, not dress up as that person, but to assimilate their thought patterns and ideas to such an extent that one could respond to another theologian from the same period in a authentic persona. So I became a Black bishop in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Henry McNeil Turner, and I realized by the end of that semester that the things that I was really curious about Bishop Turner hadn't been answered in any other writing that I could find. So I just kept going and ended up writing a book about that was published in 1992 by University of Tennessee Press. And it was a dissertation on the way. But before that, I lived for 5 years in Washington, D.C. in the Black community. I had been involved in criminal justice reform kinds of activities, which really engaged me with the Black community. Before that, I'd been a student at Boston University and been involved in social justice organizing that brought me in connection with the Black community. So, and my dad was a social worker who, during the time of the war on poverty, there's a lot of kind of history within the family, not just my uncle, but, virtually every family member engagement with racial justice issues.
I'm going to follow up just on that last phrase about racial justice issues. There's a question about the word racialization, which is not as common to some of our friends and some of the discourse in the United States, and curious what the relationship is between the concept of racialization and anti-racism work.
Oh, that's a really great question. A race is first, it's a fiercely contested kind of concept, but secondly, it's something that is ultimately not biological information, but it's a social information. Race is what we collectively define it as, and it shifts in numerous ways. Even during lifetimes of those of us who are in this, who are here tonight. The quote was referring to was that after 9/11, Muslims were being treated like racial outcasts, so that a lot of the news scholarship that Sylvester Johnson, another friend of ours, Judith Weisenfeld, really points to the fact that race and religion actually are so intermingled and intertwined. In European concepts of race are very different from American concepts of race. European and Nazi Germany, the the most despised race were Jews. So are Jews in the United States, where do they fit racially? Are they white? Or, do we adopt the European model? Where, the whole experience with Nazi Germany renders the racial formation there just tremendously and entirely suspect. So Jews have been racialized as the others in many contexts. Muslims in this country after 9/11 have been racialized as the other. One thing and this is pretty recent. This is, even in the past 5 or 10 years, but American religious scholars are pointing out that in many respects, concepts of race and religion are intertwined and very difficult, if at all possible, to separate out.
And I think the other part of it is what the relationship between anti-racism and racialization is.
Mhm. Yeah. So it certainly complicates it, doesn't it? The fundamental dynamic of racialization in the United States has been to push everything towards a white-black dichotomy. If one comes into the United States as an immigrant from another country, one has to figure out where one is within that spectrum. And, the whiteness versus blackness tend to be the two overwhelming paradigms. Racial justice work, is struggling against the paradigms, but also, and this is what my students at FAMU would have emphasized, however it's defined, race is real. You can say it's a social but not a biological concept, but it's real. It's I'm talking about racialization. They'd say, Steve, talking about racialization is a useful thing, but in the present context, we need to struggle against the racial oppression that James Cone was talking about, for example, in our quotations. One has to work at a number of different levels here.
And that actually brings us to another of the questions, given that the concepts are socially constructed and the reality is very concrete. I'm curious if you can talk more about the real places where you see racial justice being pursued on a variety of levels, what specific instances of places where you see people combating the racism that we've been talking about.
Well, I think the Black Lives Matter folks have been conducting a masterclass for us in this over the past 10 years almost, since the death of Trayvon Martin. I think the work in terms of police change is very important. Before I got into graduate school, I briefly mentioned, I was involved in the decarceration movement, against the mass incarceration. And that's something that Quakers have been involved in one way or another over the past half century or so. Symbolic changes are important. Bringing down the statutes of Confederate generals is important. There are lots of ways to creatively interact with this, and in the wake of the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, several of the students here at Richmond at ESR and Earlham were involved in marches, Black Lives Matter marches within the Richmond community. Sometimes getting harassed by the police for that. It's a long story I won't get into. These activities are important. There's a lot of people who have inspiration to, a lot of us who have inspiration to continue work on this. And it's important that we continue work and build solidarity and build momentum.
Building on that, I think one of the things Pendle Hill has been exploring is how can Friends specifically show up as friends in that struggle. We've come together with FCNL and AFSC and FCE and now Quaker Voluntary Service, also in a Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism that it started with a 40-person cohort that will have another cohort bringing together people in Friends communities working on anti-racism, both within the community and the larger community. And part of our question then is for the cohort and also for those who are interested in supporting the cohort, what models can we share of racial justice work in Friends communities specifically? And I'm curious if you've seen or have anything to share about the ways that Friends specifically are showing up in these racial justice movements.
That's a really great question. My current meeting is Oxford meeting, as you mentioned, my introduction to Oxford meeting in Oxford, Ohio. And one thing that we did was that when Oxford had its Black Lives Matter rally, we just showed up as a community. We had our Quaker sign. Everybody came. It's just a small meeting. So it was 9 or 10 people or 12 people showing up, but we all showed up together. I think there are there's probably a lot more going on than I'm aware of, but I certainly among the young Quakers who are here at ESR, the interest in anti-racist work is very strong. Anti-racist work and anti-racist organizing. Where can we show up as a meeting? Where can we show up as a yearly meeting? Another example of anti-racist work at the yearly meeting level. We have a here in Wayne County, sort of the one of the heroes of the abolitionist movement was Levi Coffin, known to some as for his involvement in the Underground Railroad. The community 9 miles north of Richmond, Mountain City, which was Levi Coffin's home for 15 years, has a celebration every uh, uh, every year annually called Levi Coffin Days, and merchants were showing up, selling Confederate merchandise. So we organized, joined in a petition campaign, and petitioned the sponsor of the Levi Coffin Days, which is the Lions Club, not to allow the sale of Confederate merchandise at this event, and they agreed when we presented them with our petition.
Yeah, I think this question of how do we show up together in this work in our communities feels very related to the question of where spirit feels alive, of when we're able to turn towards each other and bring our collective power to these larger movements. There's one specific question from the New York yearly meeting has been identifying the absence of quotations from persons of color in their faith and practice, and curious if you have suggestions or sources for them.
Yeah, they can. Well, I mean, one obvious source is Blackfire, that I co-edited with Hal Weaver and Paul Kriese. But there's others, and I'd be glad to correspond with them about that.
There's a really, I think, very painful question that I think is really it's underlying everything you've said of, given the teachings of Jesus and the dynamic Quaker faith tradition, why has social prejudice remained so persistent among white friends from the beginning of the Quaker movement until this very day? Are we failing to live up to the potential and reality of our faith tradition? And I think the implication of the question is that we are, and the question is why.
That's a really great question. And yeah, I mean, you go back to George Fox, just a few years after the start of the Quaker movement, he's writing letters to the West Indies, and the letters, I mean, the letters, what Fox wrote were, was often just a series of Bible quotations. But when he's addressing racial equality, it's hard to improve on his Bible quotations. That human beings are all of one blood, and that that there should be no distinction between persons and so forth. And yet, when Fox, 14 years after writing this letter, arrives at Barbados, by that time, for one thing, through his marriage with Margaret Fell and the marriage of her eldest daughter, he is family to some of the largest slaveholders in Barbados. And so he takes a less clear stand, doesn't repudiate his former statements. It's what Sylvester Johnson is getting to, and in this book on African American religions, are all these entanglements, religion, economics, society, that we're involved in. And I think, speaking just for myself personally, that maybe the Quaker form of worship and meditation, and just spending time in silence each day and thinking, and praying, and and letting this weigh spiritually on our hearts, is about as good a way as any to really begin to contemplate how to set ourselves free from this enthrallment, this enslavement that we're all involved in, but it's pernicious, it's tenacious. And somebody we look up to like George Fox was caught and was entwined in it as well. And one of the reasons that we look at John Woolman and read his work so carefully is because he was somebody who in the worship actually found some meaningful ways to work towards freeing himself from these economic ties, economic entwining, economic confining and chaining that we're all involved in.
There's no easy answers to that question, but I think that it's the attempt to answer feels really important, and it's kind of an important basis for the question we were addressing earlier of what to do about it. And part of what I heard you talking about is relationships of who we're putting ourselves in relationship with, who are we building alliances with, where are we situating our communities, and how do we really consciously build relationships with movements that will give us insight into the question of why and what to do about it. There's a question about terminology. I think I heard you use both the term enslaved people and also slaves, and I'm curious if you can talk about that distinction and why people are increasingly using the word enslaved people.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's true that I do use both terms. In the scholarly community, the trend in recent years has been towards enslaved people. I'm not sure that there's a huge distinction, but with enslaved people, it makes clear that the so-called condition of slavery is not anything that's intrinsic or inherent, but rather imposed from the outside, and consequently is not real, genuine, or authentic.
There's a question of how you see racialization showing up in the academies in which you've served, and the relationship between racialization and affirmative action, which I think is it's a complex question that I'm curious how you'll interpret.
Yeah, great question. It's well, I mean, it shows up in the academy the way it shows up in other places. I mean, it's in other words, it's something that requires a constant struggle and awareness. In my professional associations, like the American Academy of Religion, that feels like a genuinely strong anti-racist space that really where people have worked pretty diligently to create a new paradigm and to live that out. So I find that a very hopeful space. Within institutions of higher education themselves, we always need to work. We always need to work on it. And, I'm pleased, at ESR and Earlham, the work that we have been doing. And oftentimes, I remember several years ago, some student protests about, well, why aren't there more faculty of color here at this campus? And I think that was, and the faculty administration response to students was essentially, you're right. And so, we need to work on that. And so, and I think there has been some work on that in the years since those protests. But so on the whole, I'm looking at the academy, at least the parts that I know the best, I'm pretty hopeful. But I also know we're not perfect.
I'm seeing a really, I think, valuable continued response to the question of the use of enslaved people. I think bringing into this conversation that the issue is not only in the academy and is not a new issue, but is a question of terminology that feels really important, that using the word person recognizes the humanity of people who were enslaved, which feels like another important component of that. And mentioning that young people are among those who see a huge distinction and are increasingly calling for change. So I'm grateful for that comment and wanting to invite that into the space as well. Yeah, I think it's I think that all of us are learning ways in which our words have been infected by some of these systems that you were talking about. Why are we in this situation? Is so much of our language and so much of the ways that we've been taught to think incorporate some of these frameworks. And I think it's a constant process of growth to learn new languages and new systems to expand our ability to imagine other systems. There's another question from a friend about hypocrisies. I think that's the ways that we were speaking about Fox's hypocrisy on slavery. I'm curious where you see hypocrisies among friends today.
Yeah, that's a difficult one. At first, I'm always grateful when people point that out. If they point out that I myself or let's say an institution I'm involved with is hypocritical in some respect or another. Oftentimes it's something that I probably haven't been focusing on or thinking about as clearly or squarely as I need to. Hypocrisy is one of those things that is hopeful to the extent that some wit said hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. In other words, there is a standard to which you can call the hypocrite. Nothing's coming to mind right at the moment. But I think the reason we are so keen to call out hypocrisy is, if we take that last definition, there's a hopeful element to it that you can shame, that shame will provide a motivation to improve the situation.
Yeah, I have a question I'm trying to formulate about the peace testimony and structural violence. And I'm curious, I think that I'm not sure if it's directly related to hypocrisy or not, but I'm curious the ways in which a lot of our racialized systems function as structural violence, and how the peace testimony calls friends to respond and calls us to think about mechanisms that movements use to resist those forms of structural violence.
Yeah, I think for that I could maybe go back to the discussion that I entitled Trees, but really is a lot more than about trees. Because, what is the response of Quakers or any person to lynching? One is to name it. When Ahmaud Arbery got lynched in Georgia, we didn't necessarily put that term lynching to the event. George Floyd's death was a lynching. I don't know whether you call exactly Breonna Taylor's death a lynching, but it was along those lines. One thing that is required in our society to show that is to show that the institutions of justice that mob violence does not need to be met by retaliatory violence from the people being attacked, is for systems of justice actually to work. And got some measure of that with the prosecutions of the perpetrators of violence in the deaths of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery. But overall, I mean, there still is a lot of structural violence, as you're saying, being unaddressed. The part that I didn't get into in the lecture, is that Howard Thurman, who grew up amidst all of this, stronghold of Ku Klux Klan in Florida, and amidst lots of racial violence, Thurman was a pacifist. He's a member of the wider Quaker Fellowship. But one thing that Thurman was very clear about was that those like Jim Cone were not hypocrites. So he recognized that people who needed to address violence of the oppressors, whether it was something as massive as the oppression of Nazi Germany or something closer to home, those people needed his quiet counsel and tacit tacit support sounds wrong, but not his criticism. So part of it is, part of what may seem like hypocrisy sometimes is really the kind of moral conundrum that we find ourselves in. That if we may have the wisdom to realize that whether we fall on the pacifist or a non-pacifist side of whichever side we fall on, that there's not a clear answer, and that people conscientiously may come to a different result.
Steve, thanks so much for everything that you've shared with us tonight. I'm so aware of the limits of our language and the way that we're all continuing to still learn. There's questions still coming in that I think we're not going to have a chance to address tonight. But I am really looking forward to continuing this conversation. I know Pendle Hill has a number of conversations coming up. They are not yet on our website, but will be in the next month or so for some winter programs, inviting friends into conversations about reparations and commitments to reparations, and some structures for thinking about that, especially with attention to Quaker institutional legacies of relationship with slave holding and the slave trade. So I hope that we'll be able to share those opportunities with people who are participating here tonight to continue this conversation. Is there anything else you want to share with us before we close?
Oh, just my profound gratitude. Thanks for inviting me.
We're really, really grateful to be able to start this conversation and learn together in our imperfect language and our growing understanding. So I am going to stop our recording.